Hello, and welcome to a special edition of From Here with a View, in collaboration with the Drag Arts Oral History Project. My name is Sherenté Harris, and I am your host for this episode. In 2025, We Are the Seeds began discussions with Wilfredo Hernandez, founder and executive producing director of the Drag Arts Oral History Project, to find a way to bring Indigenous drag artists into the archive while also sharing their stories with our audience at From Here with a View. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest today, a groundbreaking artist and Two-Spirit community organizer, Miko Thomas, Chickasaw, also known by her stage name, Landa Lakes. Landa Lakes is originally from Oklahoma, but has been based in San Francisco for decades. Lake serves as a co-chair for Bates, the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits, a community-based volunteer organization offering culturally relevant activities for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex Native Americans, and is the co-founder for the Bates Two-Spirit Powwow, the largest and first public Two-Spirit powwow, and the co-founder of the Weaving Spirits Two-Spirit Performance Festival, now in its 6th year. She has served as a judge on many drag pageants, and her drag troupe, Brush Arbor Girls, perform nationwide, utilizing drag shows to raise funds and awareness for Native and Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ communities. As this conversation is for the Drag Arts Oral History Project, as well as our show From Here with a View, the questions have been drafted by the team at DAOHP and have been asked of all participating artists in the project. That said, I'll add some follow-ups that I'm particularly curious about. And I guess we should just start with a general welcome. Shall I call you Miko or Landa? My brother, before I came on this, he always tells me, Sherenté, you always say Landa Lakes. It's Landa Lakes. So, my apologies.
No, you can say it either way. You can say Landa or you can say Landa. But Landa is typically best because it really goes into the whole iconicness of Landa Lakes, which is sort of the iconicness that I sort of based the name off of, the tongue-in-cheek mascot. So either way, but Chukma, which is our traditional greeting in Chickasaw, which means, which we say says hello, but it actually means good or beautiful. Speaking of which, I love what you're wearing today. Is that corn? Is that a corn print?
Thank you. Not corn, it's like beadwork, but it does kind of look like corn.
I could totally see that as like a great outfit for myself if I ever wanted to make it into corn and yet be elegant at the same time.
You can borrow it.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. To just start, we're gonna start really simple. Could you just share your name and pronouns again, and then today's date and location for the record?
Sure. My name is J. Miko Thomas. I also go by Landa Lakes. Pronouns, I'm not really glued to any pronouns at all. In the Chickasaw language, we don't really use pronouns so much. I always say the thing about pronouns is I don't really care about pronouns as long as you don't use them maliciously. I've been called by many different pronouns, and the only time that I really don't like it is when you use them in a mean way. And you know when you're using it in a mean way, and I know when you're using it in a mean way. So don't do it. So, you know, just treat me like a person, and that's good. But yeah, so anyway, I come from the Tupelo community of Oklahoma. That's where I grew up. I grew up very rurally. And so when I lived in my very first city ever was actually here in San Francisco. So I was just like a kid from the country, and then boom, I was a city kid. So that's sort of a little bit of my background.
So I'm really curious about how myself growing up in the woods of Rhode Island, And whenever I'm going to school in the city and I say I'm from Rhode Island, no one even thinks about the woods of Rhode Island. But coming from, small town, country, community, uh, how do you feel that kind of played into um, your identity and finding or understanding yourself? Because very similarly, I totally resonate with this aspect of, pronouns, so long as they're just used in an honorable way, I welcome anything. And this is just my experience, but I feel like part of my upbringing and the community that I was around is part of the reason why that is for me. But I'm curious if that or if any other things have kind of shaped you as a result of your origins.
Absolutely. I think growing up, very rurally, I always say that, growing up in the middle of the country meant that I had to be very creative. I didn't really have any neighbors. The nearest neighbor that we had was like a mile down the road, and of course it was a relative, because we pretty much I don't know if people know much about like what we call allotments, but in Chickasaw country, we have what they call allotments, which came from the Dawes rolls, where everything got split out, the land got split out. So my relatives were always around me, and they weren't necessarily close, but we were all sort of like in the same area. So even when I went to school, my school was very tiny. The Tupelo community was comprised of like maybe 250 people, but even that 250 people didn't live in the town. It was like spread out. So like within the town was like maybe 100 people, but everybody else was outside the town. So, to say that I lived in Tupelo is sort of like a misnomer. It's like, no, actually, I lived outside of Tupelo, but went into Tupelo to go to school. I think that when you're growing up in the middle of the country and not having people around you, you become very creative. So you create your own little world, and then your cousins come over, and your community is very closed and very small. And because of that, I think there's a way that you end up keeping tradition without having any sort of responsibility to that tradition, meaning that you're taught tradition without being like, you know, you need to know this tradition. No, it just sort of like comes into your brain because it's just there. It's just part of who you are. And a lot of the traditions and stuff that I was taught was just because it was there. It wasn't because like they wanted to preserve the traditions. It was because, this is how we lived. And for the most part, we didn't have running water. So we did things very traditionally. And because we were not the richest folk in the world, living in the Indian community back in the 70s. So it was a tough life. We got richer. We got richer later on. We got running water, and soon we were living it up. But we had to be very creative when I was younger, because back then it was subsistence farming, and so we raised our own plants, and so there was a lot of like traditional plants that were grown, and there was all these like little traditional things that we did without even realizing we were doing traditional things. So we did traditional harvesting without even thinking that it was traditional. All of this sort of like got embedded into my head without even thinking that I was preserving tradition at all. It just sort of was a way of life. So when I came into the city many years later, when I went into the military and ended up in San Francisco, it was a big change. It was a big shift. First, I was in the city for the first time, but more importantly, when I went and I found like the indigenous community, it was a very different community from what I had back home, because this was a very urban community. Back home, everybody was Chickasaw. If they weren't Chickasaw, then they were Choctaw, and Chickasaws and Choctaws were pretty similar. And so we have a lot of the same traditions. We went through the same experiences. We're so close to the same that our languages are almost the same. We share the same sort of like songs and Bibles and stuff like that. So we're almost the same. So coming out here, I come across a lot of folk that were very different. So urban natives are very different from very rural natives.
Absolutely. Two things. First is I have some Choctaw cousins, and one of them is actually carries my name, is named Sherenté. So there's a little Sherenté who is Choctaw. So we have that connection. And then additionally, I think you illuminate something very real here about, stepping into these new communities. But of course, you carry, your home and your people with you wherever you're going. I think at one point you used the language of like the creativity that comes out of that. And funnily enough, in my own family, we do all of this talk about now today, we're rich, baby. Compared to in the past, we are rich now, but definitely rich in love and community. So I actually felt a lot of similar feelings when I went to Brown, and there was a small Native community there, but it was not at all the same as like what I was used to. So I'm curious, when you think about your earliest memories of drag or getting into drag, how that related with your sense of the world at that time.
When did I first start drag? That's an interesting question, because if you're talking about drag as just performance, there's that. There was many times as like a child that I got caught in my sister's clothes. Many times. There were times in which I would set up chairs and have my cousins line up outside my window because I had a really long window. And I would open up my window and then pull back my curtain and climb out my window and have like a towel on top of my head and do a performance for my cousin, which was all well and good until my youngest cousin, Roller, wanted to participate. And I said, that's immoral for a girl to do it.
There's an old home video of me and my sister, and I say, I'm a woman. And she says, you're a woman? I'm a woman. And I say, no, you're a girl. I'm a woman. Exactly.
Yeah. So there's many times when I used to, dress as a girl and just go out. Me and my friend Felicia used to go to a lot of powwows when we were teenagers, and we would just go to powwows dressed as girls and just go and flirt and run around the powwows, and most people had no idea. And as I got older, when I finally started going to the gay clubs, I found that if I did drag, I could go in with the drag queens and then I could perform. So my first time actually doing drag was at a club called the Rec Room, which was an underage club in Oklahoma City. And I got in, but I got into the underage club that I was still underage for. Because it started at 18, but I was still underage for it. But I still got in. And that was the first time that I did drag. And I did like a very simple number. And after that, I was able to go where all the people were, into the regular bars. I don't recommend that if people are underage, don't go into bars. But but yeah, I would sneak in with the drag queens when they were going in. It didn't always work. Sometimes I would get caught. So I would get kicked out. I would get banned. And they would say, you can't come back for 30 days. And I knew that,
Only 30 days?
yeah. And I knew that even in 30 days, I would still not be 21. So it didn't, it didn't really matter. I would still not be 21 years old.
So, how now today would you describe your drag? And has, I imagine there's been an evolution, or how much of an evolution?
Absolutely an evolution, a complete change. So, there's been a complete change from like the very beginning. When me and Felicia used to go out, there was like a big change because at that time it was about just looking like a girl, just looking
Mm,
like any normal girl going out to a powwow. It was about being passing and making sure that nobody noticed us. And then when I changed into doing drag at the clubs in Oklahoma City, it was about pageantry. Oklahoma City is always about pageantry. It was always about like, over the topness. And in Oklahoma City, it was even back in the 80s when I was doing drag, it was very competitive. And if you looked terrible, they would tell you. They would tell you. So you had to have like a certain level. Otherwise, you would be read very, very badly. So when I came to California, I got into a relationship, and the relationship I was in did not like drag. Even though when I got
mm.
in the relationship, they met me and I was in drag, they did not like drag. And so I stopped doing drag for a very long period, like about 10 years of not doing drag. And after that relationship was over, I went back to doing drag again. And the club that I went to was a very infamous club here in San Francisco. It was known at the time as Tranny Shack. And it was filled with shock queens, as you could tell by the name. And I went to the club, and I remember thinking at the time, I thought, these queens look terrible. Because they used like all this like clown makeup and it was very blocky and it was like all these like supra colors and everything, which is literal clown makeup. And I was just like, oh my gosh, these queens look terrible. And I entered a contest that night in which I did a number in honor of the club. I did a very somewhat shocking number for folks in which I climbed out of a giant vulva
Oh,
and
wow.
yes, yes. It was a whole story. It went along with the song Sugar Walls. And I won the contest that they had for that night. And suddenly I was a part of Training Shack and I became a part of like their history. And so the next day I went to Krylon and bought clown makeup.
Oh, you became one of them.
I became one of them. I went and I bought the clown makeup and I was like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to change into this. I guess I'm gonna have to be a clown. That's the way it is. So I went and I got the super colors and everything else. And I also did like the clown stuff for a while and then I was like, okay, I can't. I'm I'm gonna have to go
I'm
back.
too beautiful for this.
Right? I have to go back to my Oklahoma roots.
Right.
So I had to refresh at some point. So I think at some point then I got involved with the court system here in San Francisco. And for those people who aren't familiar with the court system, the Imperial Court started back in 1963. And but I got involved actually with the Rebel Court out here in San Francisco. So there's the Imperial Court that was started by Jose, and then in 1973 there was another court that was started called the Ducal Court of San Francisco, and it was sort of like a rebel court because it was started by H.L. Perry, who ran for empress a few times and didn't become empress. And so he was like, fine, I'll make my own court. And so he created his own ducal court and it became its own thing. It became its own entity. And so the ducal court is still going on after all these years. So I ran and I became Grand Duchess 36. And so it's all about like jewels and things like that. But the thing about it is, it's a fundraising organization. And the reason that I got involved was because, so I have a lot of drag children. And one of my drag children got a title within the ducal court. And I had to go and see what it was all about because I was like, what did you get yourself into? So I went to one of their meetings, and there's an organization that had sent a check back. They said it was like for $200. They said it was too small for them to go through all the trouble of cashing and all of that. And I was like, too small? And I was like, the Native American AIDS Project could use that $200 and buy toothbrushes, or they could buy socks or something like that for all their Native American clients that other little grants and stuff don't cover. Like, you know, a lot of incidental things that the Native American community could easily use with just like $200. So I was like, I'm going to join this organization so that I can give some money to the Native community. So I ran and I became Grand Duchess 36, and that was my plan. I went in and I started giving money to Native organizations. And you know, since I started as Grand Duchess 36, now we're up to, I think, Grand Duchess 53, and now we're going to go on to Grand Duchess 54. But ever since then, there's always been a Native organization that's been a
Oh,
benefactor.
wow.
And, you know, I don't pick them. After my year, you know, whoever comes next picks whoever they're going to give charity to. But I guess since I started bringing these Native organizations to people's attention, they're aware of them and they're like, oh yeah, let's give to this Native organization or this Native organization. Also, another great thing about me being a part of that during that year is that when I came in, I also brought people's attention to the Castro Country Club, which is a clean and sober space within San Francisco. And so ever since I came in, also the Castro Country Club not only has got involved with the Ducal Court, but has also been benefited every year. So it's been sort of like a windfall for some of the community organizations here in San Francisco.
That is fabulous. And I think a lot of times we hear people talk about like the importance of activism, and so often we find that like the best activists out there are really just people that are living their lives. And as a result of that, you know, you living your life and bringing attention to things that seem obvious to you and should be obvious to others. I'm really curious about how you feel activism has tied into your drag career. You gave a really good example there, but I even just think in terms of visibility for myself, when I first, you know, came out to my family, one of the first things that my grandmother did was she talked about you, Landa Lakes, and I think she pulled up some magazine and showed me you in the magazine. And I think for many other young Indigenous, queer, two-spirit people like myself, I think you have been a trailblazer. So I'm really curious about, do you feel like drag is always involved in activism, or in what ways do you want your drag to be activism? And are there some ways where you want it to be its own thing outside of that?
You know, that's a good question. You know, I try to think of like, you know, my life without activism, you know. I don't know what I would do. I guess I would, you know, what do you do? Shrink back? Um, it's hard to say because, you know, I grew up in such an interesting time. I grew up in Tupelo, but for a while we lived in Tishomingo for just a little bit while my father went to Murray College. And while he was there, he got involved with the American Indian movement for a short while. And so my first taste, I guess, of activism came from my father getting involved with that. But not only was he getting involved with that, but also at the same time, what I call my uncle, my grandfather's brother, will say, um, though not necessarily blood related. His name was Buster Ned. He was actually Choctaw, and his grandmother had married my great grandfather. So he spent time growing up with my grandfather as though they were brothers. And so because of that, he formed the Chickasaw Choctaw Preservation Committee, and they went around dancing and sharing like a lot of our dances and songs in the 70s and trying to preserve that and trying to bring it all back. And this was like right before 1978 when the Indian Religious Freedom Act came in. So this was like right before this happened. He was already trying to preserve all of our songs and dances and everything else. So 1978, it just sort of like flowered and opened up, and all of a sudden it blossomed and was able to go everywhere and everything. So in some ways, I guess you could say that my family was already doing sort of like these activist things. And then when I was at OU, I used to take chalk and write on the sidewalks for the GLA, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance. And I would say, "Are you gay? Call Miko." And then I would write the phone number for the GLA, not my number, just the phone number for the GLA, so that people would call and get the office. And of course, there wasn't very many Mikos on the campus, so I immediately got a reputation. So everybody sort of knew. So even outside of drag, I guess you could say there was that. And we did a die-in for at the time because AIDS was sort of like a thing that was happening in the 80s. So I would say like before drag, there was activism. And then I think that drag helped to push it even further. And I would say that in my early days of drag, I was not doing activism. I was doing pretty things in Oklahoma City. I was just
Mm.
like a pretty queen, and that was it. When I started doing things at Tranny Shack, the drag was different. It was storytelling. There was a lot of shock value to it. But one of the things that they did a lot in that sort of genre of drag was that they were telling stories. Everything was a story. And so I think that sort of, for me, it created like activism also within drag for me. So I was able to take that, and with the Brush Arbor Girls, we were able to push it even further. So we created this thing called Shake the Feathers. So it was the Native American Health Center, the Brush Arbor Girls, which was with Bates, and the Native American AIDS Project. And we all three worked together. And so in order for it to work, we had to provide entertainment. So we provided the entertainment, the Brush Arbor Girls. But part of that entertainment had to be something based around safe sex. So our numbers had to be sort of like thematic. So all the girls and all the performers and boys, because I also had some boys in there too. So we all had to like create something around these very solid themes. So
Mm.
I think that creativity around that helped to produce some interesting numbers that were in itself like this jumping off point for like the politics of my body and what I'm doing with it. And so yeah, so politics and drag combined together are really something. You know, it's tough. It's a tough thing to describe it exactly, but I think that there are people who do drag that don't have any politics combined with it.
Hmm.
And then there are some people who, when they're in drag, it's completely political because they're going to come out and they're going to give you something, and there's going to be a message along with it. And I think that a lot of times I'm going to come out with either something that's very campy or something that's very political. If I'm not in the mood to cry, I might come out with something glamorous and that's it. I'm not going to work hard for it. But if I really want to send a message of some sort, then yes, I like to work in politics. I've worked in stories about the boarding school system. called Paper Indians. It's a very long piece that I've created. I've worked in things about MMIW. I've I've worked in a lot of different pieces about the effects of the government's intervention in Indian politics that actually have led to natives being homeless within our own homelands. So
Mm,
yeah, so there's a lot of politics that can easily be squeezed into performances, and that's all the art of storytelling. And who better to tell it than native people who have had the art of storytelling since time immemorial?
right. I think there's the element of activism, um, but I also think uniquely in your case, I'd be remiss not to ask, looking through the lens of ceremony, and I think I've always been taught growing up that, you know, even the littlest things that we do when we're going and gathering berries or roots or, um, even just getting up and greeting the day, that as we're doing all of those things, we do it with Thanksgiving. And with that mindset, I'm interested in, have you thought about your performance and maybe its intersection with ceremony? And in particular, you brought up storytelling, and my parents, for years, they have been storytellers together. They often will go like back and forth. So my mother will tell a story, and then my father will tell a story. And they are both opposite in their styles. So my father tells very comedic stories, and has this comedic twist to them. And my mother is far more serious and sober. And when you're talking about, these stories that you're putting together, it reminds me of that beautiful mix. So please, if there's anything you have to share on that front.
Yeah, years ago when I was a teenager, me and my sister, we used to be a part of this thing called the Chickasaw Preservation Committee, and we used to go out with a few other college students. There's like a selection of us that we would go out and we would share our culture. And so it's funny that you would say that because my sister loved to tell like all these animal stories, but I love to tell our people stories. But our people stories were often very violent, and people love the animal stories because they're all like really cute and sweet. But the people stories are always like, and then he took out a bow and killed him, and you're like, oh my god, why? It's just like that shocking moment, and people are just like,
Right.
oh my god. And it's like, don't worry, he didn't really die because he's like, long nails. And I loved including long nails because long nails is the one person that like in so many of the stories, people would go to long nails for advice, which was this person of great wisdom, right? But also a person that would like capture you, and then you would have to like work for long nails or whatever. But one of the things that long nails would always say to a woman who would come for him to advice is, I have no need of a woman. Which to me, every time I would hear it, would be like, oh, well, look at her.
Mm, right.
I know what that means. So yeah, so every time he came up, long nails, I was always like, oh, I get it. I know why he has no
Hmm.
need of a woman. So I loved having him in any long nails story that they would tell.
Mm.
I was always down to listen and remember those stories.
Hello, this is Zachariah Julian. Exciting news! Project Antelope is now Seeds Art Market. Seeds Art Market is an Indigenous-led online marketplace carried forward by We Are the Seeds, supporting Indigenous artists with resources and opportunities to grow on their own terms. When you support Seeds Art Market, you're strengthening Indigenous economies and helping carry Indigenous creativity forward. Seeds Art Market, created with care, rooted in community, and shared with the world.
Well, I think that there's something really beautiful and different in the way that for many people, they think about drag as being something that takes place on a stage. And I mean, you tell these early stories of, just going to the powwow and all done up. And I think it's hard a lot of times for us as Indigenous people to kind of neatly keep these different things in their discrete boxes, because like these examples that you're giving of storytelling, maybe it wasn't necessarily what people would think of as drag in a drag bar, but in a way all of these things are connected. They're all part of the storytelling tradition. I think of, at least in my own community, but of course in many communities, are trickster figures, and the joy in the game of flipping these expectations on their head. And it all goes back to the great mystery. So I'm curious about what you would name, and it doesn't need to be Indigenous, it can be anything, but what you would name as some of your biggest inspirations for your drag, but in general for all of your creative work.
Well, I always tell people this. I really learned my makeup from my sister. I watched my sister compete in native pageants. When I was growing up, she competed as Chickasaw Princess. She competed in Powwow Princesses, and she was Miss Bacone. Bacone is like an Indian college in Oklahoma. And so she was doing all this. And in the 80s, for those who don't know, the makeup was wild. And so she was sort of like my inspiration for a lot of things. Of course, she would sometimes look at her makeup palette and say, "Why is all my yellow gone? I don't even use yellow." But she was one of the inspirations of mine as to why I started makeup-wise. And then I would say that, when I started going out in Oklahoma City, my best friend was Russell Big Horse. We were wild in Oklahoma City and we went everywhere. Russell didn't always do drag. He was usually like always with me though, and always like pushing me and telling me, you should do this, you should do that, you should go here, you should go there. Russell was like my right-hand person and as well as my best friend. And so Russell was always there. Him and Samantha Wilson, they were both like my best friends. Felicia was crazy, so she was there just to fan flames every time she was there. Those were like my besties. Those were the people that really got me going in Oklahoma City and everything. But I would say that outside of that, when I started doing like a lot of stuff here in San Francisco, for instance, especially in Tranny Shack, I work really well with my partner under the drag name Miso Horne is their name. But their real name is Hung, and we've been together for like 23 years, and a lot of times we will bounce off each other, like the things that I'm doing. Sometimes I don't, because sometimes I have a very clear vision and I'm like, this is what I'm going to do, and I don't want you to say no, you know?
Right.
And so I know exactly what I'm going to do, and so I'm not going to bounce it off him. But there are other times that we work really well together in creating some performances. So sometimes some of my performances are not just my own creation, but they're me and him working together to create a performance. Because sometimes I can think outside the box, but when I'm working on something that's really, what I would say, very indigenous,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I don't really want the input because it's
Mm,
sort of like I know what I'm talking about. And so I don't really want the input from outside because even though I'm glad that you have that perspective, but someone from the inside will understand what I'm showing. And I don't necessarily need to teach you. I'm sharing this, and someone who's on the inside will understand it as I understand it. And that's okay. And that's what I want. And if you don't understand it, that's okay. Because I want people who are inside the circle to understand it. People on the outside of the circle can watch it and appreciate it and maybe not fully understand it. And I'm okay with that because my target audience in something that's purely indigenous is indigenous folk. So
mm.
in a very indigenous number, I don't really want the input. But if I'm doing something that's a little more open, then yes, then me and him can work together on creating something like that. But yeah, so sometimes I'm like, no.
Very real. Uh, and I think that is a very common, I don't know if I should call it a wall, but it's something that, Indigenous artists push up against is this tension of, what's expected of them as an artist. One of those main expectations being like this transparency, this readability. And I think that's fabulous that, you see your art as this opportunity for expression that's not, muddied by needing to explain it. And it's almost like explaining it kind of dilutes part of it. It gets rid of some part of the essence of it. And I love the language that you used of, people can come and watch, and what they understand, and what they don't. I even think, there's a beauty and a place for that, for, not knowing, but seeing something beautiful or heartbreaking, whatever it may be. And you've talked about how your creative process, it seems very collaborative, but I'm curious, how often do you rehearse a piece? I'm sure there's lots of rehearsing that goes on in your mind. Do you rehearse? And when you have like something that you want to do, is there a certain number of times that you'll repeat it in perpetuity, or?
It depends. If we're doing like a brush arbor girl piece, then we'll rehearse it quite often because like a lot of times I'll pull in like what we call like a drink water dance or actually what we used to call it was a drunk dance, but they've changed the name. They want it to be a little more a little more fancy. But we used to call it drunk dance, now we call it drink water dance. I'll pull in a drink water dance. And so, because I'm Chickasaw and the other girls are like from different tribes, then I have to teach them these dances. And
Mm,
so I'll teach them how to do like these Southeastern dances. And so that piece we have to rehearse quite often so that they get it down. And then I have to like also edit the dances too so that it's for the stage. So it's not entirely traditional, you know.
Mm.
And I'll add little pieces. Like there's this one piece that we did. We added in like a kick the bush dance, and so I had to be very strategic in how I got everybody into place for kick the bush, and so that in itself was a challenge because I'm not a choreographer, but I like to think I am. So we have to rehearse that over and over again just to get it so that it's very pleasant for people to watch. And at the same time, I try to do little symbols or some symbolism while I'm doing it. So I'm trying to like incorporate dance symbolism all together at the same time. So some of the audience may not know it, but indigenous folk who are sitting out there might recognize some of the symbolism, and then they'll be like, oh, I get it. I know why this is happening. Yeah, so rehearsal definitely has to take place for that. If I'm doing something that's just my own, I do have to rehearse it because I do things that are very involved. So
Mm.
there's a lot of pieces to it. So I have to like go from this to this to this to this, and it has to be very systematic, and it has to be like at very specific times. I was just doing something the other day where the person started my music at the wrong place, and so I stopped and I said, "Can you please restart?" And they did it again in the wrong place.
Oh no.
And I was trying to play catch up the entire time, and the audience I think was unaware of it, but it was so much stress on me because I was trying to get to the spot that I needed to be fast enough, and I couldn't quite get there. And I felt it. Nobody else did, and I always try to remember that in my head is like the audience doesn't know. People who've
Right.
seen the number before know, but nobody else does. It's new for them. I try to keep that in my head, but of course it doesn't. It just sort of like leaves me sort of spinning, and I'm like, do this quickly. So yeah, when things go wrong, you just have to pretend that it's fine.
Yeah, I also tend to have that kind of like perfectionist bone where, oh, it will eat at me, and I have to remind myself it doesn't matter. Nobody knew. And then that other part of my brain says, oh, yes, they did know, but they don't know.
Yes.
Um, I think that the inclusion of like the symbols that you're talking about and the dances, it feels very, like you said, involved. It kind of reminds me of like, for lack of something better to compare it to, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats, where the cats come out and they're interacting with the audience. Has that ever been part of your performances, like actually going out and touching or interacting with the audience, things like that?
Yes, that has been a part of the boarding school number that I do called Paper Indians. And that took place shortly after they found the 215 children buried at a residential school up in Canada. It was initially a way for me to deal with all those children being found in the unmarked graves. And so it initially started because I wanted to do a mother's round dance, have all mothers stand up and dance with me in a round dance.
Oh, wow.
And so I cut out 215 paper Indians and passed them from mother to mother. Yeah.
That is beautiful.
Yeah. And then it developed into like it's a much longer piece now, but that's initially how it started. It was my way of dealing with it.
Mm.
You know, how do you feel about it? How do you cry? How do you let it go? And so I thought a mother's round dance was the best way.
I feel as though what we have in our communities is so rich, but it's so much less than other cultures. I mean, you go to a museum and you can see other cultures, just endless belongings that are in their cultural archive. And so as a result, because of time and natural weathering of our sacred things, because of colonization and genocide and things being stolen from us or being locked away in museums where we can't access them across the sea. And because of all of those things, what we have left, I feel, is so significant in our ability to build and dream new dreams. And I think the things that you're engaging with your drag and with your performance, to me, that's what's coming into my mind. The importance of not only preserving those traditional things, but using, those aesthetics, those songs and dances and stories and teachings to birth new things. And I think that's a poignant example of, thinking, how do we engage with grief and mourning today, and in old ways and in new ways? I'm curious if you see your work in that way, or if I'm just projecting that. But also, so often we talk about the generations to come ahead of us. And do you see your work as being in relationship to those next 7 generations?
I do. I do, because like quite often in my much larger pieces, one of the things that I often try to do is I try to bring in current indigenous artists, like their music into into those spaces. Like I do have songs that I'll do that are just like modern pop folk, but in the much larger pieces of like, Weaving Spirits or something, I like to use current indigenous artists who are out there making modern music, like Tia Wood or Fawn Wood, who are like really out there like making music that is current and relevant today, and people may not have heard them. Tanya, who's out there making sometimes very scary sounding music for people that may have never heard of throat singing before, and just pulling sounds that people may not necessarily be as familiar with, and putting them into songs, and using things like Tanya's song, for instance, Colonizer, that can be somewhat very brutal for some folk to hear, but it's an important message too. You Can't Take My Tongue, I think, was like a very beautiful song that she had, and using it in such a cool way to exemplify the boarding schools and how they try to assimilate everyone into only speaking English. Things like that, I think, are really great to see in a contemporary way with contemporary music, and showing that we are not just people of the past. We don't have to just like go back into the archives and pull up something, that's ancient. We're people of today as well. And I think people sometimes get lost in that, and they think that, we're just all like from the past, but we have multiple facets. We respect our past, and our past is our present, And we can also be contemporary too. We live contemporary lives. As a matter of fact, people often work with Indigenous people and not even know it. You know, they may have worked with someone who's Indigenous for many years and not even realize that they're Indigenous folk who may go to a powwow every summer, and
Right.
not even be aware of it. So Native people are contemporary people, and people just have the idea that they're just some image from the past.
How do you see your roles in your community as a contemporary and traditional Native person being, of course, and Two-Spirit is a more modern term, but how do you see your place in your community as a queer Native person?
You know, that's a very good question, because I've always felt like I've always been a part of like my Chickasaw community. I've done a lot of things for my tribe in the past, especially when I was younger. I represented my tribe. I went out and I did stories for my tribe. I went out and I did dances for my tribe. I did a lot of those things. And then, I moved away. And even when I moved away, I still was able to create the Chickasaw Council. So we had like the satellite council out here. So I created it here in San Francisco, and then later it moved down to Sacramento. And so I've been able to stay really connected to my tribe, and I go back for their veterans organization. We have a veterans society, so I go back for it each year. So I've remained very connected to my tribe. My tribe is like very Christian though, and that's always been somewhat of a rub there.
Mm.
So that's the only thing, the big Christian mafia that my tribe has. They're still they're still very Christian, yet quite often I'm asked to do things back home. I'm still asked to come in and do funeral songs, even though I wouldn't particularly say that I'm necessarily like a Christian anymore, but they'll still ask me to come in and go, oh, so and so died. Can you come in and sing Song 48, which is like one of our hymns? And then I'll come in and I'll do that song. Yeah, so they still want me to do those things, and they'll have me do a drum song. I did a drum song for a wedding, so they still ask me to do things. So it's an interesting thing. Then out here in the Indigenous community in San Francisco, I'm pretty integrated. I'm a part of the American Indian Cultural Center out here, and I'm a part of Bates, of course. So I'm pretty integrated into the community. So I would say as a Two-Spirit person, I'm really well known out here in the San Francisco area. But back in Oklahoma, I am pretty integrated as a Chickasaw person, less so as a Two-Spirit person. So almost like when I land in Oklahoma, my Two-Spiritness sort of like is almost obscured or even omitted from the conversation. But it's more about, oh, the Chickasaw ways, oh, this Chickasaw song, this Chickasaw language, can you do this? Can you do that? But not so much, anything about my Two-Spiritness. But when I'm here in San Francisco, I can be like my full self. So in my own community, in the own Chickasaw community, I do feel like people overlook it. But I don't care. I still will bring in my partner. They may omit it, but I will be my full person.
That was what I was going to say next was, have you made peace with that, and in what kind of way? So it sounds like you still are going out and not letting any of that stop you at all. Yeah. You talk about your military service. Thank you for your service, by the way. And being part of this veteran society. Do you see that as being like an important balance in any way? It feels very much like, there's the very stereotypically feminine and then the masculine. Has that ever been something that you've, felt important to show balance? I say that because I think the pull of people's expectations, but I think even beyond that, even just those then almost become our own expectations for ourselves. There's something there, at least for myself, where I feel that kind of tension, and sometimes I'm more at peace with it, and sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I say to hell with it and to the wind, and I'm just, being me. But have you found any rhyme or reason to that balancing act?
I don't know. I think that like ultimately I feel like I'm somewhat balanced in that, since I was, I grew up hunting as a child. My dad took me hunting all the time. My dad also took me fishing. My dad was obsessed with fishing. When I was younger, my dad used to drink a lot. And as he got older, he replaced drinking with fishing, which was great. It was much better. And when he replaced it with fishing, I did not like fishing. I thought fishing was very boring. So I was not a happy camper when it came to fishing. I would have rather went hunting. I didn't mind hunting, but fishing was boring for me. So I did not appreciate fishing at all. When I think back to it, I feel bad in some ways, because I'm like, this was keeping my dad from drinking. I should have been more supportive. But yeah, I enjoyed hunting, and I actually enjoyed boxing a lot too when I was younger. And I think that I wanted to be a boxer for a while because I was really enamored by Muhammad Ali as a boxer, but then I realized that I was good at blocking, but I wasn't really great at being fast enough to get like a lot of the punches in. So I realized that I wasn't going to be like a premier boxer, There wasn't anybody who was like famous for being the best blocker. So I knew boxing was not going to be like the career for me. So, but I did enjoy boxing. So there was like, some balance there. But I also liked feminine things, so I liked both. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I was growing up, when my friend Samantha, for instance, transitioned, I had like this person, her name was Tandy Andrews. She was like this pageant queen and everything, and she was from Texas, but she'd come up to Oklahoma City to do shows. She would hang out with me, Samantha, and Russell, and she was always trying to talk us into transitioning. And so she was helping Samantha get all of her stuff for transitioning and everything else. And I think that's the reason why I didn't go that route, that route, because I just felt more of a balance of, I could be feminine when I wanted to be, and I could be masculine when I wanted to be. So I felt like I was sort of like in the middle, and I didn't feel like I was one way or the other. So it was that realization that I was not the same as Samantha. Samantha was different. So I was like, oh, well, I guess we're not the same.
And it can seem so like, that just is what it is. But I really do think there is a tremendous amount of courage that comes with something like that, because in some ways it can be harder to not just be trans and be legible. And I guess that's the running theme for our conversation today, is finding being comfortable in being illegible, and even beyond that, the beautiful things that can happen in there, in that illegibility. I don't know, we're coming close to the end of our time, but I definitely want to hear from you about, there's actually a couple things. The first, and if this is the only one we get to, that's fine. This is the main one, is, do you have any single message that, if you could only have one big takeaway that people have about your work, what would that message be?
I think one single message that I would say is that ultimately, for anybody, just be authentic to yourself. Because I think that it's very easy for people to be influenced by others. I know that when I first came out and I listened to stories of others, and I felt as though I needed to be like them and be somewhat, emulate them in some way. And then I realized I didn't. I could just be myself. I didn't have to be like everybody else. And I think authenticity is very important. And I think you have to figure out who you are. And that's hard, and that's a struggle. So don't just repeat the words that your friends say. Find your own words.
Well, that was beautiful. And I don't think there's any better way we could have finished this off. So thank you, Miko, for taking your time to share this incredible story with this audience and with me. You have made a real change in my life, and you're one of those big inspirations for me. So I am so thankful for you and all the work that you've done. Thank you. And thank you all for tuning into this special episode of From Here with a View, in collaboration with the Drag Arts Oral History Project. For more information on DAOHP, please visit dragartsohp.com. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of From Here with a View, a We Are the Seeds Philadelphia podcast. Please subscribe, share with a friend, and leave us a review. You'll be helping us grow our listener community and elevate the impact of our podcast. You can learn more about this podcast at wearetheseeds.org. From Here with a View, producers are Zachariah Julian and Tyler Nagoya. Executive producer is Michelle St. John. Sound mixing and original theme music by me, Zachariah Julian. To hear more of my music, follow me on Spotify and Apple Music. From Here with a View logo art is inspired by an original oil pastel drawing by Jason Weesaw. Graphic design by Fernanda Leon. Lead funding is provided by People's Media Fund.